The first case that we're going to speak about is one I think maybe some of you have familiarity with. It involves a missing person investigation. Victim's name is Chad Holvig. And on July 11th, Maricopa County Sheriff's Office received a report from the family that they were concerned about his absence. They had not heard from him in some time and thought maybe that foul play was involved. And I have to preface this by saying that whenever we get a missing person report, especially when it involves an adult, unless there's a strong indication of foul play, it can be really difficult, depending on that person's pattern of practice and their lifestyle, to determine if there's a criminal element, if foul play is involved, if they are in danger, or if they have just not been in contact with the family and there's no other issues involved. So it is critical, in this case is a good example of how important the family can be to those circumstances, because when they are passionate about their concern and when they're able to articulate why they believe that this is uncommon and that their loved one could be in danger, then it emphasizes and it helps us have a better understanding of the urgency involved. And our investigators in this case understood that quickly and acted quickly, working with the family. So the report came in on July 11th, and short time thereafter, our detectives start to do what we call basically a pattern, a behavioral pattern, a life pattern, to determine, are you still doing the same things that you were doing, whether it's an electronic trail or phone calls or things of that nature. And when there is no indication that there's any so-called, we'll say, pulse relative to your pattern of practice, then that tells us that there is probably a heightened concern. So our investigators, in working with the family, were able to ascertain where they believed that Mr. Holvig had last occupied or been seen. The address of that location was 11,101 North 181st Drive in Goodyear. Investigators worked to obtain a search warrant for the property with the hopes that they would recover evidence or information that could lead us to Mr. Holvig and determine his whereabouts and his well-being. They executed that search warrant on August 4th. But prior to executing the search warrant, one other issue of concern that came about was Chad's son, Dalton, had also stopped his pattern of behavior. So although they didn't necessarily indicate early on they thought he was missing, he was just not, there was no indication that he was actively involved in anything that he had been involved in. So our investigators were concerned not only for Chad's well-being, but for Dalton's. When they executed the search warrant on the property, which is about a 3/4 acre property, as you can see here, with some multiple outbuildings and cars and a lot of items on the big property, we used our tactical operations unit, the SWAT team, to execute the search warrant. Upon execution of the search warrant, they detained two people, husband and a wife, who are the residents of the property, and they also located Dalton. Dalton had 3 gunshot wounds, which he indicated had occurred previous month, several weeks before. They were not tended to by any medical professional. He was being kept there, according to his statements, against his will. And any care that he got for those wounds wasn't truly care. I mean, he was suffering from infection and some other issues, and was hospitalized immediately, cared for by our employees, and hospitalized immediately thereafter. A search of the property, investigators recovered several firearms. They recovered illegal substances, and they also recovered 2 deceased bodies. The deceased bodies were unidentified at the time, immediately transported to the medical examiners, not only to determine cause of death, but to identify those individuals. So I'll be preemptive here, because I know for at least some of you, you asked some questions, because I know you like to think you're investigators, but no disrespect intended, that's what we do professionally. You're journalists, and when you ask some of these questions, it's because maybe you just don't have an understanding of what investigations look like. We don't put out information on unknown bodies and unknown cause of death until we know who the person is and what the cause of death is. So yesterday, Mr. Holvig, Chad Holvig, was identified by the medical examiner as one of the deceased bodies. The cause of death is not yet determined. The other victim in that case was identified here as Anthony Vane, a 31-year-old male, died, cause of death believed to be gunshot wound. So both these bodies were recovered on the property. We have not yet filed charges against anyone regarding the death of Mr. Vane, and we have not yet determined the cause of death, or I should say we, the medical examiner, for Mr. Holvig. So until the cause of death is determined, we're not going to know whether it is a murder or a homicide, because all murders are homicides, not all homicides are murders. There could be other causes of death. The fact that he was kept there and no one was notified could be a completely different crime if law enforcement wasn't made aware of the circumstances, and we will investigate that further. But right now, both cases of homicide are still under a fluid investigation. There's a considerable amount of evidence that is being processed, both forensic, technology, all types of evidence to determine what we can regarding the circumstances that occurred leading to the demise of the two men. Dalton Holvig, to my knowledge, is still in the hospital recovering. And the charges thus far against the two, I don't know if they're homeowners, but the two on the property, give me the next slide, please. Roberto Bernal and Christina Bernal were charged. They were booked aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, possession of a weapon by a prohibited possessor, and possession of a weapon by a prohibited possessor for both. So Roberto was charged with the aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and he was a prohibited possessor. Christina was charged with being a prohibited possessor. Just yesterday, the prosecutor added the charges of kidnapping to the suspects. That's what we have at this point. I would tell you that there is a strong possibility that both of these victims were on that property for an extensive period of time. It is extremely difficult to determine time of death when you know that the elements, to include the high temperatures for an extensive period of time, contribute to the decomposition of bodies, of the human body. But there's a high probability that other people were on the property and may have some information regarding who's responsible for these deaths and if one or both are homicide, and we know that one is if both are homicides. So if someone has information out there that could be helpful to this investigation, you could either contact the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, and we'll make that number available to you, or you can call Silent Witness if you want to remain anonymous. But I will just recap by telling you this is one of those cases where it has multiple working parts. It is exceptional work by all the detectives involved in the investigation, to include the Tactical Operations Unit, that the family played a pivotal part in making sure that their communication with this office emphasized the heightened urgency so that we acted as quickly as possible to try to locate Mr. Holvig. And all indications are that we know Dalton, I believe his gunshot wound was sustained on the 9th of July. Is that correct? I'll confirm that, but it was several weeks prior. We do not know, we don't have definitive information yet as to when his father was murdered. So there's a lot of things that we're still working through right now to tie up all the loose ends in this investigation, and it is ongoing. But this is an environment, and this is a circumstance where it is indicative of what happens when people utilize drugs and are comfortable with violence and taking lives and then leaving deceased bodies on the property. So I'm happy to answer what questions I can, but understand it's going to be limited. My position is, I'll get to you. My position is, I understand you feel like you have this right to know, but you don't have the right to know right now, because my responsibility first and foremost is to the victims of the case to make sure that we can effectively prosecute and hold accountable those responsible. So with that, fire away.
Yeah, Stephanie Foxton, could you confirm where those two bodies were found? We heard it might have been barrels.
Yeah, we don't discuss those circumstances, and the reason that we don't is because at some point in time we'll be interviewing suspects, and there's information that only those responsible would have knowledge of, or those close to the case. So any details that I provide specific to the environment, the crime scene, could undermine our ability to prosecute later on. So I appreciate your question. I'm not going to confirm that, and I'm not going to share any information that is that specific. Thank you.
You said that kidnapping charges were added to the suspects. Is that just for Dalton or for these other two men as well?
Just for Dalton right now. Any potential criminal charges regarding, I apologize, I want to say his first name was Anthony. Until we determine who's responsible, we can't put charges forward until we know the individuals that's responsible for it.
Were there?
So it's a great question. Dalton actually lived there and stayed there for some time, and there's familiarity between the Bernals and and him. And then Chad had just recently, according to the family, gone there to either just visit or stay for some time to go see Dalton. So Dalton's time there was a longer time frame. Chad's was just from the point when he went missing, but it wasn't an unfamiliar location. Everybody that was on the property had a relationship to some extent.
Anthony, too.
Anthony is the one that we're still trying to better understand the timeline and his relationship with them. He, when we look at the dynamic of the family being the Holvig family and then the Bernals, that relationship we understand pretty clearly. What we don't understand is what Anthony's relationship was with anybody on the property yet.
How would you describe that relationship between the Bernal and the Holvig family?
Well, just that they didn't know each other. They, again, they were occupants on the property, staying on the property. So we know that they had a purpose and they had a relationship to be there. Anthony, we don't know. I mean, obviously they could have had some form of relationship. We just don't know why he was on the property. We have no idea to be able to determine time of death, so how long he was there.
Can you give any update on the condition of Chad Holvig when you figured out, when you saw the body? I mean, like, when you were able to identify him? I mean, what was his, like, was there any, like, wounds, or can you describe the body at all?
Oh, no, his wounds were substantial. He had gotten no care whatsoever. They were gunshot wounds to his lower extremities. So investigators described it as it was infected, and it was, apparent to them that he was suffering. His consciousness, I guess, could have been also impaired to some extent due to substances, and we're not clear on what or how or who was giving him those substances, whether it was some form of what they thought was medical treatment, or if it was a contributor to the fact that he was being held against his will.
And that was Chad or Dalton?
That is Dalton.
Okay.
Yeah, Dalton is the one who had the gunshot wounds and is in the hospital recovering.
In terms of Chad, can you talk about what condition he was found in, or I know you said there's no cause of death right now, but any kind of wounds?
Yeah, we'll wait until the medical examiner actually gives us a full report on, once they determine cause of death, decomposing, dead body. I mean, that sounds really cold and graphic. I don't mean for it to, but until we know more about it, it is a man who was found dead, and his body had been there for some period of time in the conditions outside, which in Arizona is hot. So decomposition happens pretty quickly.
You mentioned illegal substances were also found on the property. Is anyone facing charges for those?
Those are still pending. We're waiting for a chemical analysis back from the lab. So once we get those and able to determine if we can tie those substances specifically to an individual, and I think a part of it's going to be, as Dalton recovers, what are we able to ascertain from his statements and be able to then substantiate through evidence that we find on scene. And again, I call out to the community every time we have a situation, just because we have folks in custody and we may have suspects or investigative leads. It is a puzzle of information, and there are people out there right now that know exactly what happened or could know, what happened. And if you'll call in and help us solve this, go a long way with this community and with the family.
Would you say that Anthony and Chad's bodies were in similar types of conditions, or was one markedly different than the other?
I don't know. I wouldn't know how to properly answer that and keep it within the framework, as I said, where I don't want, when investigators interview potential suspects, we know that they're going to know details that others don't. So anything that I share could undermine the hard work by investigators, and my job is to protect the integrity of it. So I appreciate your question, but I'm just not willing to answer that.
Just so I have the timeline correct, family reported that they were concerned about Chad on July 11th. But then within that time frame, between that and the search warrant being served, they also became concerned about Dalton. Yeah,
they expressed, I think, that our investigators working alongside the family, because so what you do is you're identifying a pattern of behavioral practice, a pattern of life, right? So how, if you go to the ATM, if you use your phone, if you check in with whomever, if all of a sudden those things come to a hard stop, then we know that there's a heightened concern. Dalton maybe had not been as actively engaged with his family as Chad was. So initially it's just like, okay, Dalton doesn't check in as much. But as we're going through it and we start taking a look at that also, because we're looking for Chad and Dalton, we know where he is, and also we realize Dalton's activity had diminished dramatically also. And that's what led us to, and the family, to be more concerned for him also. But the search warrant was executed on that property with intentions believing that we would see Chad there or find information leading us to Chad. And unfortunately, the circumstances were dire.
Any kind of motive other than said that you referenced in relations to drugs and violence.
So, well, you have different, even though they may be intertwined, you have the motive behind why was Dalton assaulted with a firearm, and then you have the motive behind who's responsible for Chad's murder. And what normally happens is you need to know who before you'll know why. That is a great contributor. So we know who's responsible for shooting Dalton, but we don't know all the motivations behind it yet. We'll work through that until we can really pinpoint who's responsible for how Chad died, and if someone was it was at someone's hands, then we can determine motive better. But right now, those are unanswered questions.
You said you thought people had visited the property.
That's a speculation. There's no evidence to say folks did, but just with this lengthy time frame, we know that the front of the house, that there was kind of a tattoo shop, that Roberta was, I guess, a tattoo artist, so I don't know if anyone received tattoos in that time frame. I don't know who came or went, but it's a long time. I mean, for someone to have no visitors in that lengthy period of time would be unlikely. So they may know something, they may not, but I'm just calling out to the community to help us if you do.
Criminal history at all for the Bernals?
Everyone had a criminal history with the exception of Chad.
Anything of note?
I don't know what would be noteworthy, but we'd be happy to get you that information. You can determine if it's noteworthy or not.
Just to clarify, I know because you had said at the beginning, not all homicides or murders, etc. Do you believe Chad was murdered then?
I don't have an opinion of it. Anytime you have an environment where there are drugs and there are bad actors and this type of potential violence, the cause of death, could be anywhere on the spectrum. The idea that Dalton was shot 3 times obviously heightens our concern for how his father, what contributed to his demise. But I just don't want to be premature in assuming anything.
See, you know who's responsible for shooting Dalton?
Correct. Roberta was charged with shooting Dalton. That's the aggravated assault charges.
So Dalton was reported missing on July 10th, and it was known that the father had gone down to go visit him. Did the family ever go to the home of Dalton to check up on either or?
July 11th is what I have in this. I'm incorrect. I don't know if the family went there or not. The investigators would know. That's just not a question I asked, but we can get that answer for you. I would tell you that I just want to make sure that I express my concern for first of all, my condolences to the family, but secondly, my concern for their safety, because until we put a bow on this and know who's responsible, I think anyone that is in the family could have some concern for their own safety, not knowing what the contributors were as to why Dalton was assaulted and if someone's responsible for Chad's death. Well, until we charge somebody with it, I'm concerned. Until we know unequivocally that everybody that's a participant in the death, again, of Anthony, I'm always concerned, but I'm concerned every day of the week because, unfortunately, we were in the business of trying to stop violence and hold people accountable. So, concerned.
Anyone else out there right now?
I'm looking for whoever's responsible, and whether that's 1, 2, or more, we just want to wrap the entire group up. So until the evidence provides us facts to definitively say how many people were involved, we will go about it not knowing that answer until they're in custody.
Should the community then be concerned?
As I said, I'm in the business of law enforcement. I see far too many cases when we're talking about. There's a lot that we don't. So if the question is, are we concerned that there's a murder at large that could potentially harm others, I think that this incident here will play itself out in a way that there was a relationship between the person responsible for the murder and the victim. So anybody outside of that realm should just have the level of concern they do just in their everyday life, as it pertains to potential crime or being a victim.
Just to clarify, have you spoken with Dalton? Like, I know you said he was in the hospital still. Like, have you followed up with him at all yet?
Investigators have, but when I say that, I say it from my perspective as being the sheriff, understanding what the investigators are trying to accomplish. So you have a person who allegedly has been held against his will for a lengthy period of time. He's got substantial injuries that he's recovering from. His state of mind as well as his health, and depending on how they were caring for him, are going to impair him mentally and physically. So I would just think that you'll get statements initially that are helpful, and over time maybe he recalls more or he clarifies things as he gets stronger and he gets healthier. So it'll be an ongoing fluid process, and it's possible that we may get clarification suddenly because he has an epiphany or he's more clear of mind.